Hi, thank you for having me. Greetings from First Nations University of Canada here in Regina, Saskatchewan. I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak on behalf of our university and on behalf of some of the research that I've been undertaking and ongoing. Again, um, it's been a challenge and on this education journey to um, get my research to where it is and all the back end stuff, all the work that actually goes behind it. Um, Again, thank you for inviting me to participate in tonight's event here. A lot of the research that has been done so far in my doctoral studies basically has been looking at, what's really out there, what are the challenges that communities and both urban and rural communities in different countries around the world have been experiencing. And a lot of the big challenges that we see through the research is it's that urban rural divide, so to speak, and the sustainable goals that have been presented for sustainable development, sustainable cities in the future. We take a look at one of the things that I mention to my students every semester is the world population is growing, and that we need to figure out ways to create opportunities for, kind of that balance between our urban rural knowledge that is out there. Sustainable cities requires a lot of rethinking the process, to rethinking how we do things, and in turn, basically ensuring that everybody, this collaborative effort exists or will continue to happen now and well into the future. Sustainable cities is in some parts of the world is lagging, but in other parts is very advanced. It becomes a challenge when you have multiple stakeholders that are sitting at the table or who need to be invited to the table in order for new ideas to be discussed and developed, and as well the potential costs associated with a lot of the ideas. That you can have a good plan, but you really need to have everybody on board in order to figure out, how does sustainable cities look like now, and how do we want to see ourselves in 25 years? Nobody can see the future, but you have to have some type of document available that can be reviewed annually for the next 25 years, and basically, what worked and what hasn't worked. You're constantly making changes, right? This is the part of governance that we see in many municipalities, different levels of government all around the world. So from the research, from what I understand or from what I read, and trying to decipher, like, how does that exist from an Indigenous rural perspective? A lot of the knowledge that a lot of communities have, here in Canada, um, there there needs to be they too, as a stakeholder, need to be included in a lot of the tables that exist at the different levels of government, as well as the different businesses and organizations that support government agencies, government levels themselves. So in order to, how do we look at our urban um, planning process here in this city? How does the urban planning process exist in our West Coast or versus our East Coast or in the northern part of our country here in Canada? And it really takes a lot of communication, which is extremely critical because various parts of the country has to make certain changes to their development plans, their processes in order to adapt to the realities of climate change. So, for example, in the East Coast, there's a lot of soil erosion due to the melting ice that is actually raising the sea levels. So, a lot of our First Nation communities in along the east coast of Canada are actually dealing with soil erosion and the loss of their lands, which is particularly concerning because a lot of the land that they have in their traditional territories has very significant value to the communities within that area. Historically, a lot of their elders, relatives who have been passed on basically are buried in a lot of those spaces. So they're working feverishly with the engineering companies to develop new types of infrastructure to minimize the soil erosion within the East Coast, which is, in order for to protect their traditional territories. When we take a look at the West Coast here in Canada, I was in Vancouver about a month and a half ago, and walking along the traditional territories of the Western Indigenous communities, which basically is right a part of Vancouver City. You can see the traditional uh, tie-in built into the engineering infrastructure in order to help minimize the potential erosion along the shores along the West Coast. And I find it very interesting because the different mindset that they have there, where the realities of climate change, rising sea levels is impacting how the city is preparing and maintaining its boundaries along the sea lines, in order to prepare for the eventuality that the sea levels will rise to a certain level. So a lot of the engineering firms out in Western Canada are working alongside a lot of the Indigenous communities in order to really understand, how does that knowledge impact the infrastructure that they're developing right now, and really in order to maintain a, a sustainable city where uh, urban development can continue to grow, but at the same time, uh, monitoring and trying to minimize the impact that it will actually have to the land itself and the surroundings. So when you take a look at our northern coast, very far north, it's completely different as well. But it's the same issue that the Indigenous communities up there are dealing with. The rising sea levels are actually encroaching along the sea walls, I guess you would say. And then again, it's impeding the developments, but at the same time, it's also encroaching their traditional territories. Again, what we've seen in the East Coast and what we've seen in the West Coast is actually happening in the northern parts of Canada as well. So when we take a look at the ideas of sustainable cities, it's the ideas or the mindsets that everybody, all these stakeholders that have to be sitting at the table and be willing to prepare to accept change. And that change means that uh, what was normally historically done in the past, it worked for time being, but at the same time, going 25 years into the future, they have to be prepared to accept a little bit of change in that process. So sustainable cities, when we take a look at it now, it's you don't have to go too far here in Canada to really realize the impact that climate change is impacting our cities. I was being in Canada here this winter, we've had almost like 4 consecutive days of -50, -50 Celsius temperature, where we've never seen that type of temperature in the prairies growing up as a kid. Normal weather for us in the prairies would be -30. So this extra cold, this deep freeze that we've experienced, and it's becoming more frequent and much longer here in Saskatchewan, that it really begins to hit home. Like, what do we have to do in the city where First Nations University is located? What do we have to do in order to protect the infrastructure from the varying degrees of temperature? So we were -50 this winter, and we're going to be +40, probably +45 humidity this summer. So you can see that varying temperatures is quite significant here in central part of Canada. Sustainable cities has to take into account that this type of weather phenomena did not exist 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So, the way I see it right now is that we have to start looking at getting all the stakeholders to the table in order to collaboratively work together for us to understand, what are we facing and what are we up against? The sheer amount of money that the municipality here has to put towards snow removal every year is growing each year. Our snowfall levels this year was, above records again, and it literally caused us almost a complete standstill in this entire city. So, we have a smaller city here, but if there's nothing moving, the economy slows and we're stuck until we can dig ourselves out. Come springtime, we're now experiencing extreme dry, and we've been under a fire ban for the past 3.5 weeks, where the grasses on the outside of the city have been so dry that they've been caused by just natural phenomena such as lightning strikes and some human, but it has impacted the city because we have northwest winds, and those dry grasses where the fires are started will encroach near city boundaries. So that has a huge implication in terms of air quality, especially for a smaller city like this. But we also have the larger impeding forests that are in northern part of Canada, northern part of Saskatchewan, that they're already preparing to invest more money into emergency management services to prepare for the upcoming forest fire season, which basically will encroach a lot of cities. We've seen that in Alberta. Part of the town of Jasper, Alberta, was burnt. Half of the town was lost due to a wildfire. Other parts of Alberta were evacuated. Other parts, smaller towns, were basically destroyed due to wildfires. So sustainable cities in Canada basically requires everybody to be on guard. Where here in Canada, they just released a new emergency management system, alert system via cell phone, where if it's weather related, which is quite frequent here in Canada now, so whether it be forest fires, extreme cold warnings, or extreme heat warnings and stuff like that, we're actually preparing, Canada as a whole is preparing for a lot of this in order to help people in all the cities across the country to prepare for the potential of what's actually going to happen. So, sustainable cities it has to be prepared. It has to be ready to develop new ideas. And, these new ideas are basically what we're here to talk about.
Esse momento aqui é um momento de troca mesmo com o Tim, porque ainda há pouco, Tim, você falava a respeito dessa cidade sustentável, né? E que nós temos aqui uma palavra criada por um filósofo indígena, Ailton Krenak, que ele diz que a solução do mundo, do futuro do mundo, está em duas palavras da perspectiva indígena, que é a florestania, que é a floresta como um ser cidadão, com direitos e cidadania, e a floricidade, onde tem que haver esse equilíbrio entre floresta e cidade, exatamente isso que eu vi na sua fala. E lembrando desses sujeitos de direitos que são a natureza, eu passo lá para a tua pesquisa que você está desenvolvendo, né? E que você estava comentando anteriormente a respeito de como a comunidade indígena ela vai começando a preservar esses recursos naturais, em especial o recurso hídrico, e como é que acontece essa gestão sustentável da água nas comunidades aí indígenas do Canadá, né? E dentro desse processo, qual é o desafio mais enfrentado por essas comunidades?
Thank you. So yeah, a lot of our challenges of a lot of our Indigenous communities we've been facing here in Canada is, um, unfortunately, a lot of our knowledge has been discounted by a lot of the scientific community. But when it really comes forward to the engineers or individuals from from the natural sciences who take a look at Indigenous communities and the knowledge that we're trying to share in order for that change to move forward, a lot of our knowledge is basically been historically, passed on generation to generation, and really what it comes down to is a lot of it is land-based learning. And land-based learning, from my perspective, is basically spending time out into in the forest or on the land to see how the animals and all the plants and how the ecosystem actually works. And that's the traditional ecological knowledge that Indigenous people bring to the table. Many take a look at many Indigenous communities, and a lot of the Indigenous communities are situated in the rural areas in various countries. And those communities are in areas where they still practice their traditional hunting and gathering forms of sustainability. And when you bring that knowledge to the table, the first and foremost aspect that is being brought forward is that idea that we only take what we need, and we can only harvest what we need at that moment in time, so that everybody, I mean, including everything within that ecosystem, is basically still maintains its balance. So from the Indigenous perspective, we through the research that I've been reviewing, is that Indigenous peoples around the world are stewards of the land, and it's their traditional ecological knowledge that they're bringing to the table, which makes a huge impact for First Nation communities here in Canada. So when we take a look at the resource, specifically water, and how you manage that resource, you don't have to go too far. So here in Canada, we have an animal called a beaver, and that beaver basically will take the surroundings, the natural building materials, in order to dam up pools of water, and those pools of water are maintained at a steady flow in order to capture, various forms of insects or other aquatic species, in order for that beaver to sustain itself, that animal. And that under, that water, these pools of water are maintained throughout the driest of seasons, in order to, sustain its way of life, and to ensure that the water levels will basically be suitable until the next rainfall. Here in Canada, we only have a short summer. So we, as we like to say, we have about six months of spring, summer, fall, and then the other 6 months is basically winter. So in those 6 months where it's not freezing, below freezing temperatures, these animals are preparing and developing, using this natural infrastructure, in order to create a preservation of this body of water, this collection of water. And oftentimes we take a look, oftentimes we take for granted that we overlook animals, we overlook the ecological, the ecology that's actually existing right out in rural areas, and we forget that that knowledge is there. The Indigenous peoples that have been, harvesting, hunting, and gathering within these rural areas, they have this knowledge, and they can basically use that knowledge to bring to the table, to work with engineers or policymakers, what have you, in order to, how do we better sustain this resource? What is the biggest challenge that we're facing is getting, I guess, getting Western society to validate this knowledge, that it is worthy, that in this climate change era, that we need to do something different. We need to collaborate, and that collaboration, you have to have that open mindset. So that positive mindset allows for many people at the table to actually move forward with this knowledge exchange, and not discounting something that may be totally foreign, but taking a look at, how does this natural infrastructure can be incorporated into a sustainable city. How does that work? And basically, it's like saying here, you're taking natural soil, topsoil, the grasses, and putting it on top of roofs, right? Here in Canada, we use a lot of asphalt shingles, and it's all black. And we all know that the color black in the summertime retains a lot of heat, so which causes a little bit more localized weather phenomena. Changing the color of your rooftop from black to white can actually be very substantially for the building itself, but also for the minimizing of the localized weather phenomena. So when we take a look in nature, you don't have to go too far. That there's a lot of mosses, there's lots. It's covering the base of trees and stuff like that, and it's done so in order to protect the moisture, protect its natural infrastructure, what it's actually trying to maintain, as well as the water levels. So when we take a look at what a First Nation community is doing, such as my own, we reside between bodies of water that were man-made. Yeah, go back 50 years ago, 60 years ago, before the water bodies were created, there was a natural stream that ran through the bottom valley of this area. And a lot of the First Nation communities within the valley knew that this was a very sustainable source that everybody could use. And, over time, that continued to exist until, fortunately, however you want to look at it, the development of agriculture started to increase within the area, which created a lot of pressure on this natural stream that was actually running through, and then eventually leading the different levels of government to pass policy, create policy, and to enforce policy to basically dam the water and to create these bodies of water, which basically was a destruction and encroachment of traditional territories. The thing that I look to now is how does the current governments of the day, the different levels of government here in this province, how are they willing to change, or how are they willing to accept Indigenous involvement? So this inclusion of this traditional ecological knowledge that we bring to the table, and allowing business community leaders to sit at the same table and say, look, we're not against developments, we're not against business, but we have to do it in a different way. And a lot of our business leaders are intrigued about this because they want to hear and they want to see how it can be done in a different way. So if that means that the resources are going to be impacted or developed in such a way that could potentially cause some harm or destruction or encroachment to any of our Indigenous communities, then we need to make sure that the table of stakeholders are listening and are sitting there in order to understand, how do we ensure that we can do something that's going to minimize the potential impact, the negative impacts? How do we create an avenue that will allow for more positive impact to everybody sitting at the table, so that, again, Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is basically at the table and to help steer or guide some of the decision making that surrounds or involves policy and policy development now and into the future. So again, there's it's a lot of new ideas, and a lot of different individuals, different governments, business leaders they're interested, but at the same time, they need an avenue to get everybody to sit at the table. So again, it takes a lot of communication, a lot of patience, and a lot of willing to change in order to, understand, some of the issues behind these different practices that can actually be implemented.
O que o Jason falava anteriormente no início do programa, a respeito de que nossas vivências, apesar de estarmos em lugares geograficamente distantes, elas são muito próximas, exatamente o que o Tim coloca, né? Nós, enquanto povos indígenas, a governança indígena, ela é movida a partir da sustentabilidade. E quando ele coloca sentar à mesa, convocar a comunidade a sentar-se à mesa, a gente não está comentando nada mais, nada menos do que uma governança comunitária, que é uma governança comum aos povos indígenas que tem como a decisão coletiva como ponto principal na tomada de decisões a respeito de tudo o que vai envolver a vida indígena. E a vida indígena não diz respeito só àquela comunidade, mas a tudo que o cerca, e em especial aquele contato de reciprocidade com a natureza, né? Então, é exatamente o que o Tim traz na fala, né? Então, essa prática de governança, ela precisa é, alcançar ouvidos comprometidos com uma escuta responsável. É o que é colocado. Aqui no Brasil, nós estamos às vésperas da, do evento da COP30 e que está causando assim um impacto muito grande nas comunidades indígenas daquele território, que não deveria acontecer. Quando sentar-se à mesa, como disse o Tim, deve ser um sentar-se à mesa comprometido. Por quê? O que está acontecendo lá no Pará? Muitas comunidades, muitas pessoas de baixa renda, não só a população indígena, estão sendo retirados dos seus locais onde moram para dar espaço para que aconteça a COP30. Então, um espaço de discussão sobre o futuro sustentável do mundo está mexendo de maneira negativa com aquelas comunidades, com comunidades tradicionais, ribeirinhos, quilombolas, indígenas. Então, quando a gente propõe, enquanto população indígena, eh, essas essas mesas de debate, de discussões, de discussão de coletividade, é importante que os governos também eles entrem nesses espaços para validar o que as populações indígenas, as populações tradicionais conhecem. Porque quem mora lá, quem vive, quem maneja o rio, quem maneja a natureza, quem conhece de sustentabilidade, nesses momentos de decisões eles ficam fora, eles têm visibilidade, mas eles não têm a fala, eles não têm direito à voz. Então, outros discutem, enquanto aqueles sabedores de conhecimentos que podem estar com um projeto pronto aí de sustentabilidade há muito tempo trabalhado, eles não são ouvidos, né? Então, é interessante que a gente também perceba essas, essas jogadas de políticas nacionais ou internacionais também, que às vezes elas trazem um emblema, uma bandeira de sustentabilidade, mas na verdade é só uma bandeira, não é de fato o objetivo dessas situações que comprometem a vida do planeta como um todo. E eu quero fazer só uma pergunta a mais para o Tim. As práticas de governança das populações indígenas do Canadá, como é que o governo ele vê hoje, que, como você disse, né, no Canadá já percebe-se muito essa questão da mudança climática, aqui também, só que há uma diferença eh, eu acredito que de conscientização do efeito da mudança climática no Canadá e aqui no Brasil. Aqui a gente ainda está engatinhando para nos conscientizarmos e lá no Canadá, como em relação às questões políticas, como é que o governo vê essas intervenções das populações indígenas?
We're seeing a noticeable trend in the different levels of government in various parts of Canada. We take a look at the West Coast here in Canada, and we take a look at what government is actually promoting, allowing Indigenous knowledge to be I guess, implemented and utilized within a lot of the engineering projects in British Columbia. Well, some of the latest examples that I can recall off the top of my head is the natural damming, or I guess the dams that are being created. They have implemented shelves, I guess water shelves that basically goes up along the side of the dam to allow the water to flow on the side. So then this way it doesn't impede the fish spawn, salmon spawn. So they're allowed to still go upstream using these various pools. Like as I explained, the beaver will create these pools. So it's the exact same concept on these man-made dam projects, and it basically allows it allows the engineering companies to proceed by creating these different types of additions to the existing dams, so that really what it does is it allows for that traditional ecological knowledge, sustainable practices to continue and not impede on the salmon runs. Salmon is a big industry in British Columbia, and sustainably done in such a way that allows for natural salmon to return back to their spawning grounds in the mountains and from the sea, Pacific Ocean. So when you take a look at different levels of government that are promoting this type of practice in various parts of the country here in Canada, you really need to see the impacts firsthand in order for um, other government agencies around the world, or other levels of government around the world to actively foster and promote this type of inclusion of Indigenous knowledge into infrastructure projects, especially when sustainable cities, sustainable development is, it's whether you live in a city or you live outside the city, it's at some point going to be impacted down the road. So having that opportunity to be down in Brazil last year, very thankful. One of the things that I noticed in one of the communities was the big lake that we had the opportunity to swim in. Well, I didn't swim in; it was Mr. Jason was swimming in, and it was pretty cold. But when you take a look at a resource that big, that water, that pool, and it's servicing a major city like Curitiba, the sustainable effect would be similar, is creating these different levels of water platforms that lead into the city. So it still allows for the natural environment to thrive, and to allow that traditional ecological knowledge to continue, while at the same time drawing down on a resource or utilizing a resource in a more sustainable practice. And that efforts of the water leading into the city from outside of the city, it would be a very long-term project, but at the same time, it would be very sustainable, especially to allow for economic growth, that progression of the city, but at the same time respecting the Indigenous communities that are located around that pool of water, to continue to develop their traditional knowledge, and to preserve it in such a fashion that they're working side by side. It's the same thing that we see in Canada, but also I believe, in the Western United States, the northwest part there, where Seattle is, which is just under Vancouver. It's the same thing that they are fully aware, where this mountainous region is home to some of the best salmon fish, and you need to preserve those fisheries at all cost. So different levels of government here in Canada, when we take a look at Eastern Canada, they're going so far as allowing some of the communities, grassroots communities, to have a big part in the ongoing maintenance and operation of some of these projects that are being developed around these water resources. So again, it's how proactive your government can actually take involved or get involved in a lot of the infrastructure projects, by allowing that Indigenous inclusion to happen within a lot of these engineering projects. And really, when you take a look at it, what's life going to be like for that area in the next 50 years? You want to sustain it, you want to maintain it in such a manner that allows for all stakeholders to collaborate equally in ensuring that this project or this resource is moving forward, even if it's a little bit slower, but it's still being pushed forward so that it doesn't hinder the resource itself.
A diferença pontual que eu percebo é essa tomada de consciência, que é muito diferente do Canadá em relação ao Brasil. Aqui, o que me parece é que todo mundo já está desacreditado de uma outra possibilidade de vida. E aí tem a ideia de que vai acabar, então vamos acabar logo de uma vez. É essa a impressão que eu tenho enquanto população indígena. O meu povo é o Mágua Cambeba. Na nossa cosmovisão, na nossa cosmogênese, o povo Omágua é um povo que nasce das águas. Então, a nossa cosmovisão diz que foi de uma gota de água que surgiu o primeiro Cambeba e a primeira Cambeba, a primeira Omágua e o primeiro Omágua. Então, a água para nós é fundamental, ela é base de tudo. E quando a gente vai perceber, volta o olhar para o Brasil, nós percebemos que hoje 38 milhões de pessoas não têm acesso a uma água de qualidade. E a maior parte, por incrível que pareça, dessas pessoas que não têm uma água potável de qualidade, elas estão na Amazônia, que é onde há o maior manancial de água doce do mundo. Então há uma contradição. E isso aí vai afetar na vida das comunidades, nos territórios das comunidades, o que nós vamos observar que é diferente em relação ao que o professor Tim ele coloca. Porque lá o governo, quando fala governo, não é só uma pessoa, são as várias entidades que formam o governo que estão querendo esse apoio, esse conhecimento ancestral que vem das populações indígenas, enquanto aqui ainda a população indígena briga para ser ouvida e quando fala ninguém quer ouvir. Então essa diferença, ela é muito gritante do Canadá para o Brasil. Então, a gente ainda, enquanto população indígena, nós tivemos ontem um encontro com uma liderança indígena e ela dizia, lembrando a respeito da questão do Rio Grande do Sul, que aconteceu na última enchente aqui no Brasil, nessa parte aqui da região sul, onde várias comunidades indígenas, que são aquelas que cuidam dos territórios, que cuidam da floresta, dos mananciais de água, é, quando elas ficaram, por conta das enchentes, com dificuldade de acesso, não tinham barco para se locomover de lá, para sair, porque o local estava alagado. Não tinham telefone nem internet, porque a internet ela não chega nessas localidades. E aí ele ia fazendo um contraponto, inclusive foi uma manchete bem pequena que os indígenas guaranis estavam pedindo socorro e fomos nós indígenas mesmo que colocamos, né? A mídia, a grande mídia, não divulgou muita coisa. E ele fazia um contraponto em relação ao cavalo caramelo, ao cavalo lá que foi manchete no Brasil e foi para fora. Aquele cavalo, ele vale mais, ele teve maior visibilidade do que as populações indígenas, que poderiam estar, inclusive, trabalhando para que essa situação de enchente não viesse a acontecer, porque a gente sabe que tudo isso é um resultado da catástrofe ambiental que o Brasil ele vem enfrentando e ele mesmo vem cavando esse caminho. Eu quero só fazer um comentário a respeito da água que nós verificamos aqui cada vez mais, principalmente na região da Amazônia, onde tem os Yanomami, a grande quantidade de rios que estão sendo poluídos, né, que foram poluídos há um tempo mais do que agora, em relação à questão dos garimpos, em relação a outras questões de exploração, e outros países eles já chegaram a tornar o rio, por exemplo, o rio Marañón, no Peru, no 2021, ele se tornou um sujeito de direito. Olha que interessante. A população indígena do povo Cucama, um grupo de mulheres entrou na justiça para que o rio se tornasse um sujeito de direito. Então, foi uma batalha judicial que teve o primeiro caso no Equador. E esse é o segundo caso onde as comunidades indígenas, no caso as mulheres indígenas do povo Cocama, eles conseguiram, por medida judicial, que o rio tivesse direito de existir, direito de viver e direito de ser protegido, né? Então essa é uma tendência que as populações indígenas estão chegando a fazer para que, de fato, crie essa política, essa filosofia da, do ecocentrismo, onde as questões do ecossistema, que são o equilíbrio da vida, elas sejam de fato o centro das discussões e das políticas públicas no mundo todo. Eu acredito que daqui a pouco o Brasil também vai entrar nessa questão de tornar-se guardião, as populações indígenas como guardião da água ou de outros meios que a gente chama de parentes, não gente, não humanos, que são os rios, que são a natureza, a floresta, porque infelizmente nós estamos engatinhando como crianças em relação à questão de preservação ambiental. Nós, enquanto indígenas, nós temos essa filosofia de que nós pertencemos à natureza e não a natureza pertence a gente, então é uma visão diferente das outras populações não indígenas. E, inclusive, nós temos assim muita semelhança com a população quilombola, de cuidar da terra, de cuidar dos recursos. E para nós indígenas, a natureza como um todo, ela não é recurso, porque essa palavra recurso, ela vem da construção de uma política onde há lucro, tudo é recurso, tudo eu posso tirar algo. Então, para nós, ela não é recurso, ela é, na verdade, aquela que nos dá o que a gente precisa. E quando o Tim falava dessa ideia de que a população indígena só tira o que é necessário, exatamente é a partir dessa filosofia que nós entendemos que o equilíbrio acontece. E nós aqui no Brasil precisamos nos imbuir dessa filosofia é, muito, porque cada dia mais nós vemos no mapa, nós não contamos mais os focos de incêndio, os focos vermelhos que marcam a ausência de floresta, nós contamos os espaços verdes que estão ficando cada vez menores. Eu queria saber agora do Tim, a respeito do que eu falei, que conselho você, enquanto um, um professor que trabalha com essa questão de valorização da sustentabilidade, que já tem um caminho bem mais adiantado em relação ao que eu estou falando aqui, em relação às vivências das populações indígenas no Brasil, que caminhos você aponta para nós, enquanto população indígena, para nós, enquanto não indígena, mas brasileiros, para também somar com as populações indígenas nessa luta da sustentabilidade?
Definitely, there is a lot that the Brazilian indigenous communities can look forward to, now and to the future, how to participate and to push for a seat at the table and in a very respectful manner. Here in Canada, a lot of our nations, we've actually had requested in writing to sit at the tables to be at those meetings where policies are being made. And fortunately for us here in Canada, we had federal policy that allowed us to basically be invited late to the meeting, but we still came to the meetings. And when I take a look at what I seen when I was down in Brazil, you have a very large collective voice of Indigenous peoples, a very large collective knowledge pool of knowledge of this traditional ecological knowledge in that beautiful country you have in the Southern Hemisphere. You have the opportunities to, work with those engineering firms to, you know, patent some of your ideas so that they're protected in every which way, shape, or form, so that it shows that the traditional ecological knowledge is worthy to a lot of the protection of your resources. It allows you to sit at the tables or request seats at the tables with the different levels of government, and to show that Indigenous knowledge needs to be incorporated into the policy decisions, in order to protect resources for not only for the Indigenous communities, but for all the individuals and all the Brazilians that are there. And, I would also recommend that any of the students, Unienti students, to look forward at developing those cross university partnerships in other countries around the world. There is, I had a chance to, when I was down in Phoenix, Arizona, United States, in January, to listen to Indigenous leaders across Canada and some from the United States to talk about how, collectively here in Canada and the United States, we have over close to 1,200 communities collectively that can be utilized as a resource to, what would work, how, putting it out there. And it was actually the lead speaker, the moderator, was actually from a very prestigious university in the United States, who presented an idea that one of the main companies, a very, space exploration company in the United States, utilized this network. They send it out to groups of people to get feedback. So it would be the same thing for the Indigenous Brazilian communities to band together to utilize their collective knowledge, whichever part of the country that they're from. You have an idea, send it out to the communities and get their input, and then, bring it back, and then, using that knowledge to help push the ideas that have Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge at all levels of government and all areas of business.
Posso começar falando da Lei 11.645 de 2008. É uma lei que ela institui o ensino, né, de cultura indígena de modo geral no ensino, na educação básica. E eu venho discutindo muito em relação a essa lei, porque se nós estivermos atentos a esses últimos 2 anos, como aumentou o número de cursos de curta duração a respeito dessa lei, né? Porque já passaram-se muitos anos e pouco ainda se viu a respeito dela. Mas eu acredito que a lei, ela só vai, de fato, ser efetivada quando tiver esse letramento crítico a respeito da lei. E o que é um letramento crítico? É um letramento pedagógico, de fato. Como é que nós vamos, se eu não sou indígena, como é que eu vou tentar? Eu sou um professor não indígena, supondo, fazer com que essa lei se estabeleça de cima para baixo. né? Então eu preciso entender do que trata. A lei ela trata das cosmologias, ela trata da cultura, das culturas indígenas, que não é apenas uma. Então eu preciso compreender esse universo indígena. Eu sempre costumo dizer, conhecer para reconhecer. Então eu só vou reconhecer depois que eu conhecer. Porque se eu não conhecer a cultura indígena, não adianta eu levar na semana das populações indígenas, um grupo que eu trago os indígenas da comunidade dele para que eles dancem, e se eu não compreender a batida do pé do indígena na terra, o que significa, vai ser apenas uma apresentação e nada mais. Nada surtou, nada prosperou dentro daquela pessoa, na concepção daquela pessoa, para ela vivenciar essa questão da cultura indígena. Uma outra coisa é, é a ambiência das escolas. Enquanto não houver ambiência escolar, essa lei vai ser capenga. E o que é uma ambiência escolar? É fazer com que todas as culturas elas sejam vistas na própria escola. Na escola em que você estudou, ou na escola do seu filho, como é que você observa o ambiente escolar? Se tem um quilombola, ele se enxerga naquela escola? Se tem um indígena, ele consegue se enxergar e se sentir pertencido àquele local? Se não, não está valendo a lei ainda. A gente precisa caminhar por esses meandres e entender de fato a lei. E para entender de fato a lei, aí eu bato na tecla que é preciso mais professores indígenas trabalhando essa lei, porque só de fato assim a gente vai saber eh, falar da dor que o indígena sente, a gente vai saber falar das verdades que o indígena quer falar e nem sempre tem essas possibilidades. Mas também eu vou colocar a situação que a gente, enquanto população indígena, coloca. A gente não pode soltar a mão de ninguém. Se tem um não indígena que ele quer somar, e a gente também, enquanto população indígena, a gente empodera aquela pessoa quando a gente sabe que ela é politicamente de acordo com as nossas lutas, com as nossas vivências. Quando a gente fala politicamente é no sentido mais amplo e mais puro possível, para que também esteja com a gente nessa luta de fazer essa lei ser efetivada em todos os aspectos, porque não é só na escola. Por que que pede-se na escola? Porque a escola é um local onde está todas as sociedades elas têm uma partezinha dentro da escola. Então, a partir da escola, eu posso levar para a macro-sociedade. E aí, a gente vai construir o que o Krenak sempre propõe nos discursos dele, que é a filosofia, que é a gente se preparar para uma sociedade da convivência. É isso que a Lei 11.645 quer, que as sociedades diversas convivam bem.
There's a lot of opportunity in that area, what Professor Karina was just mentioning. Here in Canada, we're a little bit more mature in terms of the policies that were the government actually initiated um, to allow the Indigenous inclusion in a lot of the education, primary, secondary, and post-secondary education systems here right across Canada. And I find it very interesting because the inclusion of Indigenous participation as part of the curriculum delivery within the various levels of our education systems allow for a lot of the newcomers into Canada, as well as the existing Canadians, to really get an understanding of, they hear about Indigenous people and Indigenous people, their rights and claims and all that stuff. But now you're really hearing or you're really seeing the transformation because they didn't understand, what it was all about. So, if you can actively promote that within your own country to allow Indigenous participation through education delivery at all different levels of the education system, then you begin to build that friendship, build those alliances, and the future possibilities, which is really good. What it has done, to build on the second question, for economic participation within the economy here in Canada. A lot of our First Nation communities, they're not business adverse or risk adverse, or I guess you would say they just want to ensure that a lot of these developments, these projects that are happening are done in such a manner that allows the communities to have a say, or even sitting at the table or participating as a partner in that development project. One of the things that we've been pushing for here in Canada that I'm starting to see come into fruition is the upfront remediation reclamation process to be negotiated upfront for any development project. So you take a look at a greenfield mine here in Canada can run anywhere between 50 to 100 years. The participating company that's initiating this is, basically must be able to put aside funds within this remediation reclamation project up front, so that it allows the First Nation communities down the road that when that mining project is completed, that they have the funds available to put the land back to as near close as the original state. And there's a lot of planning upfront that is required to understand, what the topography of the land was before the project started to move forward. What type of resources were impacted, what type of was the water impacted. So a lot of this, it can be done by a lot of the mining companies, any company that's out there to put aside this funds available for the Indigenous communities who are going to be there. Let's put it this way. Once that project is gone and done, the First Nation communities or Indigenous communities are going to still be living in that area. So why not create this remediation reclamation fund to allow the Indigenous communities to try and put back the land to its original state? And that may be quite a ways down the way, but as what it allows for is that inclusion of Indigenous participation in some of these projects. So the infrastructure or the development of some of these resources can proceed, but at the same time, they're taking responsibility that you're encroaching on traditional territories from these Indigenous people. And that's the recognition, the fundamental human recognition that a lot of these businesses, they often overlook, especially when it comes to the history of Indigenous people in various countries, right? So it almost seems that it's decolonializing a lot of that mindset in order for developments to move forward, by including Indigenous groups within that project or group of projects, however you might want to look at it, maintaining that resource or managing that resource from their perspective in some way, shape, or form, so that it allows for the Indigenous people to build that capacity over time in order to return the land to its near original state. Again, remediation, reclamation, negotiated up front is fundamental, and we're starting to see that here in Canada. So.